Well, good morning. Good to see everyone. I want to welcome you all. We're very pleased to be gathered here for this fourth and final session of our Justice in July series. We're very excited today to welcome one of our own amongst us, and that is Luke Bitzkie. Luke joined our church back in November, December of last year, and it's really nice to have someone among us who is a member, and we're very pleased to welcome him. I will just say a little more word about him in a moment, but I also want to say thank you all for your attendance here and participation last week as we had Lisa Jacob from Christians Against Christian Nationalism, the BJC movement. Very grateful for her work here in North Texas and also the work of BJC around the country. Thank you all for holding down the fort while I and about 50 others were in Charleston. We had a great week together, and our choir, our chapel choir just did a phenomenal job all the way around. You may see on Facebook some of their concerts are just beautifully done, and I'm grateful for the experience that I got to share with all of them, including my three children. This is the 1 year all three of my personal children were personal children. That's sure. That's true. Anyways, the 1 year that all three are in the youth group, and so that made for a very special trip. Unfortunately, some of our kids got ill on the trip or right thereafter coming back. And so the concert, which was planned for this afternoon, is actually not going to take place today, and we are hoping to reschedule perhaps to next Sunday. So you'll receive more information about that. Look and read your window, which I know you always do. So without further ado, let me introduce to you Luke. Luke is a graduate of Dallas Baptist University, and is currently a Master of Theological Studies student at Bright Divinity School. Luke is intent and interested in the study of disability and the Hebrew Bible, and he's particularly committed and interested in the pursuit of that specific discipline of study at the PhD level. He is currently applying for PhD programs, or will soon be, with the hopes of engaging in that discipline. Let me say this just as a pastor and as a friend. Luke is also a part of our young adults ministry, is a great human being, a real committed servant of the church, has brought a lot of interesting insight and a wonderful, what I would call very genuine spirit among us here at Broadway. His parents are here with us today, and this is just someone who is a person with no guile, as Jesus said about one of the disciples. And so y'all have done well, and I hope that you are very pleased with Luke, as indeed we are. Let me finally say, Luke is going to be joining Broadway for the next academic year on staff as an intern through a special Cooperative Baptist Fellowship program, which is applicable for Bright Divinity School students. So we're super excited about that. And as I'm talking about the young adults, I see several of our young adults walking in, including our newest member, Taylor, who joined last week. So we're glad to have you back. We will be back next week in our regular Sunday school classes, but this is going to be a special opportunity to have Luke with us, and I warmly welcome him. Please join me in doing so.
Good morning, can you hear me? Okay, so let me start by saying thank you so much for having me. Thank you for just coming to listen to this presentation. I hope that it's something new, something that you haven't really engaged with before, but that you can start to engage with. So let me start here by just reading the title. So my presentation is titled, Within My Walls, a Place and a Name. And we're going to engage together in the process of imagining what disability justice looks like in the church. So, to start, I want to describe a couple things on your tables in front of you. So first, there is a printout of the slides that will be on the screen. Second, there's a QR code if you want to scan it with your device. It's the same thing that's on the screen, but in case you want a more accessible version on your device. And then also to demonstrate, to start imagining together what disability justice looks like, I've put some earplugs on your table if the sound is too loud or if there's something that's too much for you. And there's also a fidget toy if it helps you focus. These are just some things that I want to start putting in your brain as a way of being accessible. Certain people need ways to stim through fidget toys or need less auditory input, and I think that's important. So let me also start by saying that you should feel free at any point to get up, to walk around, to stim if you need to vocally, to leave the room, to come back. This is an accessible space that everyone should feel as though they're not disrupting. So let's ground ourselves real quick. Let's breathe in and out just a few times before we start this reflection. So if you'll breathe in and breathe out, you'll breathe in and breathe out, and lastly, you'll breathe in and breathe out. So to start, I want to read this passage where the title comes from in Isaiah 56, if you'll read with me. For thus saith the Lord, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose that in which I delight, and hold strong in my covenant, I will give to them in my house and within my walls a place and a name, better than sons and daughters. I will give to them an eternal name that shall not be cut off. And I want you to ponder this, to think about it for a minute, to think about it, what it means, to what it could mean, and let's start. So, just to give you a quick intention of my lecture, as I already said, today we're going to imagine a future of justice and a future of belonging for people with disabilities in and the church. So, here's a little roadmap of the presentation. First, we're going to talk about what is disability. Many of us may have a picture of disability, how we understand disability. I want to give some different ways of understanding it and move towards a way that I believe is better for the future of the church. Second, I want to talk about what the history of disability and the church has looked like for millennia, what disability looks like in today's church at large, and conclude by talking about and imagining together a future of disability in and alongside the church. So, what is disability? I want, if you can think about it for yourselves, to give a couple responses. If anyone has an idea of what disability is and would like to share, please raise your hand. Just a quick word or a couple words to tell me what you think disability is. Anyone here in the middle? No one? Okay. Right there in the second table.
The difficulty in focusing.
Difficulty in focusing. In the back? Yes, that's good. Anyone on this side? Or Jenna?
Limitations imposed on an individual by society.
Limitations imposed on an individual by society. A different answer. Anyone on this side?
Limitations in your ability to engage due to an underlying mental or physical impairment that then leads to limitations due to society.
Limitations on engaging based on mental or physical impairment. Those are all great. So now let's answer this question by looking at how disability has been understood historically. So first, I want to talk about the moral model of disability. Here we have 4 models, but we're going to move through them one at a time. The moral model of disability understands disability as the result of moral failings. This means that someone or someone's parents or someone's ancestors did something morally wrong, sinned, and that this has led to someone having a disability. Thus, this model understands disability to either result from one's own sin or the wrongdoing of, or as a manifestation of impurity or punishment. So an example of this is, as we know, a story from John 9, when Jesus' disciples asked Jesus about a blind man and say, is this disability due to the man's sin or even the sins of his parents? And we should note that Jesus says it's neither. But second, I want to move to the medical model. So this model understands disability as an impairment, one which is to be diagnosed, then treated, and ultimately and ideally cured. This model understands disability to be a problem that is located within one's body or one's mind. The goal is to fix the disability and restore the person with it to medical normalcy. This is primarily done through treatments and therapies, and in some cases, surgeries. An example that we could talk about today is a doctor approaching cerebral palsy as a problem to be fixed. This includes treating someone to walk, quote unquote, correctly. And similarly, people with autism could be treated under this model to normalize their social behaviors. So that's what the medical model is. Now, I want to move to the charity model. The charity model understands people with disabilities as objects of pity or objects of compassion. In this model, disability is seen as something that evokes sympathy, something that should result in caregiving, in Christian charity, and acts of kindness. And this model heavily implies that people with disabilities are in need of help. They're in need of sympathy. And that they're in need of care by people who do not have disabilities. So an example that I'm sure many of you have seen are the viral videos of people with disabilities that are doing everyday things, such as eating breakfast with utensils or walking across a graduation stage after being in a wheelchair. In academia, sometimes we call this the model of the super crip. It's this idea that people with disabilities should be celebrated and seen as acts of charity for doing everyday things. This is also, can be an example of this also is when televangelists collect money for charities for kids who are disabled and should be objects of pity. And lastly, out of these four models, I want to present the social model. This one's a bit different. This model claims that disability is the result of societal structures or societal barriers. In this model, it's not one's physical, mental, or other condition that makes them disabled, but rather it's the structures and barriers of our society that cause people to be disabled. So, an example of this would be inaccessible public transport and buildings that are inaccessible. Buildings and public transport that do not have the proper accommodations for people with varying types of needs, such as those with wheelchairs, or those who are blind, or have hearing aids, or service animals. And this lack of accessibility is what causes someone to be disabled, to be a secondary class that's discriminated against, and thus, quote unquote, disabled in society. So these are the four models that have been used to understand disability through much of time, and as I said today, the history of the church. So, now having given and discussed these four models, I want to give a quick overview of what the history of the Christian church and disability alongside each other look like, including where the church has employed each of these four models of disability. So, again, four squares. The church in Acts. In the church in Acts, there's many supernatural healing narratives. This includes the healing of the man who was unable to walk at the beautiful gate in Acts 3, healed by two disciples. And this also, in this model, specifically of the two disciples healing the man, most resembles the model of charity, the charity model. They're having pity, they're having compassion on the man. But also in Acts, there's a story of the Ethiopian eunuch who's brought into the fold of the church in a new way that explains a new way of belonging that perhaps is akin to a model that I will discuss later. Now, I want to move to the church in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, there were many healing shrines, and there was pilgrimages to these healing shrines. one example of this, which you still hear about in many Catholic circles today, is El Camino de Santiago, or the Way of St. James. And it's a pilgrimage that people believed were able to bring about physical and spiritual healing if they made their way. And this is kind of a precursor to the medical model. Disability is something to be cured, and this is what Jesus would have done, they say. This also can be seen in the Middle Ages through the advent of hospitals. Churches were the very first places in which hospitals came to be, and you see the remnants of that in the way that many of our hospitals today are named Methodist or Baptist or Lutheran. And this, like the model at the beginning of Acts, is the charity model. Christians are to have compassion and charity upon those who are needed to be in hospitals. And third, for the church in the Middle Ages, this includes the narratives of disabled saints. There's one prominent example of a disabled saint is Saint Margaret of Castello. She was a woman who had disability who was later canonized as a saint for her faith and her holiness. This also is a model, demonstrates the charity model, a way in which the church had pity and compassion upon her because she pushed through her disabilities and had faith so that she could be, and she was ultimately canonized as a saint. This is a consistent period in the history of the church where disability was seen as an object of charity, of pity, of compassion. And now, to follow our Baptist history, I want to move to the church in the British colonies. So, first, and prominently as you'll see in many congregational preachers, disability was understood as a consequence of sin, as a spiritual trial. Many Puritan, apologies. Thank you. So, disability was understood as a consequence of sin, as a spiritual trial. Many Puritan preachers claimed that disability was a sign of moral failure, either by oneself, one's family, one's church, or one's community. This can be seen in the writings of Jonathan Edwards and other preachers at the time. And there's also many tales of spiritual inspiration when there was revivals and people with disabilities had spiritual awakenings and they were cured, they were shown to be released from the demons that held them and brought into this full healed salvation. This also is the charity model, but likewise it's also the moral model. They were sinful in their disabled state and they came to be saved in their non-disabled state. This is primarily the legacy that was left to us by the church in the British American colonies. And finally, I want to talk about the church in the 20th century, specifically the Baptist church and evangelical churches at large. People with disabilities were often recipients of charity, and they were often talked about in the context of salvation testimonies. Events like the Billy Graham Crusades were often emphasized testimonies of people with disabilities, and often use such testimonies of them being saved as ways to bring in giving, to bring in monetary donations, and to grow their ministries. This is often seen in televangelists who were overly charismatic, who brought in healing ministries and saved them. Again, a model that is based in the charity model and the moral model. And finally, often seen in Southern Baptist circles, are medical missions. Mission hospitals were established across the global South and Third World that were alongside spiritual and evangelistic missions. Go in, heal the people with disabilities, and bring them to Christ. A way that's seen, again, as a combination of the charity model, the moral model, and the medical model. So, I know that's a lot of information, but if you'll stick with me, I want to go to today and talk about what disability looks like in our congregations today. This includes moderate to progressive Baptist churches and then also mainline Protestant churches at large. So, here I have a couple symbols and the four models that we talked about earlier. First, the moral model. The moral model, marked by a red X, has largely fallen out of use. And I would argue this is proper and done in good spirit. This model espouses theological claims that I'm sure you've picked up on are deeply harmful. This claim that people with disabilities are inherently sinful, or, quote, God gave you this disability because of your sin, end quote. Or even, as mentioned in the earlier example, God gave you this disability because of the sins of your parents. Many churches have recognized that this is a really harmful way of understanding disability. And, of course, this model should no longer be used. However, the medical model, marked in the top right by a yellow dash, has largely maintained its presence in the church. This is largely due to the prominence of Western medicine in our society, which is said to be centered on the diagnosis, treatment, and ultimate cure of disability and health matters. However, I argue that the medical model's prominence in our churches is also linked to our common understanding that Jesus healed those with disabilities in the gospel accounts. And because of this, the question arises, if we're to be like Jesus, should we not also desire to heal people? This is a significant question and one that I'll come back to later. The charity model, also marked by a yellow dash, has also maintained its presence in many of our churches. This is rooted in the prominence of the historic Christian value of compassion. This is based in the person and life of Jesus. This compassion, this deeply Christian compassion, has produced both positive and negative results, with the positive being found in ministries that support the health needs of people with disabilities, but the negative has been found in the often present attitude and view that posits people with disabilities in their need to be saved by those without disabilities. This dehumanizes people with disabilities and puts them, again, as we've talked about, in the secondary class. And finally, the social model, marked by an upward-facing green arrow. This has grown in our churches. The prominence of this idea across our congregations has grown. This is due largely to the shifting attitudes in the academy, which, again, in turn, influences the ministers of churches and church congregations. In church congregations. This change in prevalence within our congregations has also accompanied many of the church's shifting viewpoints on other issues of social justice that we've talked about through the month and that we talked about consistently in our churches. Though, the matter of disability has been addressed to a much lesser degree. So, this is the state of disability in our church today. How should we imagine the future? If disability is an issue of social justice and an issue of Christian justice, how are we to imagine and implement practices that create disability belonging going forward? So, I want to engage together the process of imagining. I want to start by providing a framework in which we can do this imagining, based partially on these 4 models which we've discussed. And then I want to do this process together. So, on the screen, I've again placed these 4 models: the moral model, the medical model, the charity model, and the social model. We've discussed the history of these models as well as their present uses. However, in imagining a better and a just future for those with disability in and alongside the church, none of these models seem to be adequate. None of them seem to be able to be an ideal catalyst for bringing about justice and belonging for people with disabilities. Though there are useful elements in some of these models, they also must be understood as all falling short, with negative elements being in all of them. So, I argue that we use a 5th model. And this 5th model is what I want to present to you today. This is the cultural model of disability. And this model defines disability as the following. Disability is the physical, the mental, or other deviation from the norm of one's society and or one's cultural location. So what makes this model different? First and foremost, it identifies disability simply as a deviation from the socially or culturally constructed norm. This, therefore, strips disability of the negative elements of the previous model, such as the moral element of the moral model and the dehumanization of the charity model, while incorporating positive elements of other previous models, such as the importance of medical care that's emphasized in the medical model, or the societal criticism of the social model. This model, therefore, creates a new structure for understanding disability, while also allowing for select elemental integration from the medical, the charity, and the social model. And it allows us to address questions provoked by our discussion of the other models, such as mentioned earlier. If we're to be like Jesus, should we not also desire to heal those with disabilities? This model, in stripping away these negative elements and bringing in positive elements, creates the possibility for true belonging, which, when fully realized, is justice for people with disabilities. Let me say that again. True belonging is justice for people with disabilities. So, in beginning our process of imagination, I want to give you 5 tenets of belonging. These 5 tenets are ways to measure if people with disabilities fully belong in your congregation, in our congregation, and in the church at large. So these 5 tenets come from the research of my friend Willemijn Koivinen of the Netherlands from Protestant Theological University. She claims that belonging can and should be measured by these 5 tenets. First, the intrapersonal dimension. The intrapersonal dimension. Belonging is a deeply subjective experience, as I'm sure all of you know. And it's deeply influenced by one's own lived experience. The intrapersonal dimension is shaped by one's personality, one's biography, and one's motivation. For people with disabilities, this often includes a formative experience or continual experience of exclusion. So, to belong, people with disabilities must be able to feel as though they can belong in a place and live in a community, or in our specific discussion, be a part of a church and church congregation, both the building where it meets and the people that make it up. Second, the interpersonal dimension. Belonging requires relationships between people, between the people at your table, between the people in your Sunday school class, between the people that sit next to you in the pews on Sunday morning. For full belonging, these relationships must be sincere. They cannot be based in a dehumanizing charity, and they cannot be based in monetary inclinations. Moreover, there must be relationships of mutual dependence. They can't be one-sided. This may not be easily attainable for church communities, but it is necessary to create belonging. Third, the political dimension. Political in this sense is not talking about the politics that engage our country at the moment. Here, politics refers to everything that has to do with power structures. In our Baptist context, this means councils, boards, committees, pastorates, and yes, even the committee on committees. To fully create belonging for people with disabilities, they must be able to engage in all levels of power structures. This cannot be in any sort of reduced fashion, but people with disabilities must be able to have the full personhood and full agency that any people or any person without disabilities has. And they must have access to sit at all of the decision-making tables that people without disabilities are able to sit at themselves. Fourth, the material dimension. This dimension references how people engage their physical surroundings. Some examples that my friend Willemijn Koivinen gives are buildings, spiritual rituals, symbols, stories, food, meals, music. This, therefore, includes the church buildings and every single thing that happens within them. Buildings, meals, services, and worship must be fully attainable to and for people with disabilities. This includes ensuring that everything is fully accessible to the utmost degree. And even though our churches, and this necessity for accessibility must be met, even though our churches have never been required to comply by the Americans with Disabilities Act. And finally, the transcendental dimension. This is the dimension of belonging that transcends human relationships. In this context of church, this can be thought as one's belonging to God or belonging in God. This can describe one's connection to nature, to humanity, to the universe, though in our context, it's easiest to understand this as one's connection to God. So, for us to think about here, we ask, how do we, as a church community of both people with and people without disabilities, facilitate a sense of belonging for all people, and especially for people with disabilities, to God? So, I want to give a few examples of how we can create belonging. First, intrapersonally, I imagine that we incorporate people with disabilities in worship, in teaching, and in preaching. In our churches, for the interpersonal dimension, I imagine implementing a mentorship or discipleship program for people with and without disabilities. In the political dimension, in our churches, I imagine ensuring that people with disabilities are represented throughout church power structures and throughout church governance. For the material dimension, I imagine making all buildings and all of their parts accessible, that is, bathrooms, hallways, stages, seating, and pulpits. And finally, for the transcendental dimension, I imagine that we ensure people with disabilities can participate fully in all of our spiritual services. These are my examples, and only one example for each, but now I want us to imagine together. So, together at your table, I want you to imagine 5 examples of creating disability belonging. One for each of the 5 categories that I've given you today. I want you to discuss, to collaborate, and to be accessible in doing so. And then, once you've finished, I'll give you a few minutes. I want to share some of these examples. And I want you to think, to imagine, not to just take the ones I've given you, but to create something new. You can be as broad or as specific as you like. It can be for this congregation or churches at large. But, of course, I want you to err on the side of specificity. I'll give you a few minutes to do so, starting now. approximately 1 more minute to discuss. Okay, I'm going to ask you to start wrapping it up, and we're going to start sharing some of our responses now. So, as tables, what I want us to do is I want us to pick our favorite response or a response that you think is particularly thought-provoking. And Pastor Ryan is going to pass around the mic to our tables starting on the left, my left, your right side of the room. So, as your tables, pick your favorite response and let's share them. If you're ready, please raise your hand.
I don't know how to structure.
It's on.
Okay. I don't know how to structure this, except for things like this. But the more over time, Kevin and David both. My son's David, and Kevin is sitting here with us. They have become a more, I think, a better sense of belonging here because they've gotten to know so many people over the years that they've been here. They haven't been ostracized or anything, and have gotten to know a lot of our friends and some of the people their age too, and some of those. So the more people they get to know, and then they know them. It has to be over time. It becomes a mutual thing. That's very helpful. They both have special. Kevin, as a lot of you know, likes to direct music. David's very careful about reading the Bible every Sunday morning, the Pew Bible before the sermon. Just getting to know each other is important to them and to you too, that are willing to, as you run into them, to remember the names, get to know their names, and just be friendly, and over time, that will help.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Mutual dependence on relationships and creating relationships are so important for our interpersonal dimension. So thank you for sharing that. I truly appreciate it. And then also let me know, I forgot to say, if you would mention which dimension of belonging your example is coming from, I think that would be great.
Hi, Luke. Our
Hello.
table discussed dimension of belonging. I believe it would fall under material. We have lost many choir members simply from the fact that our disability is aging. And we can't get from the choir suite up into the choir loft anymore because it's a maze of steps and stairways. So one of the ideas we had at this table is Britton told us that perhaps we just have a team that would help a person who is disabled by aging to get from the choir suite to the choir loft, and it not just be a couple of select people so that you have to do it every Sunday because that's tiring, but a team that would allow that person to continue to sing for as long as they wanted to and still feel like an integral part of the choir and the church.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I am so inspired by that example because the material dimension is so important, and you're imagining in such specificity for our congregation. I just had a conversation during our break when one of y'all mentioned to me that if you live long enough, you're likely to gain a disability at some point. And that is a hard reality to live with, but it's so important that as a church community we come alongside and provide support and love. And I really appreciate that example, and I just love how imaginative it is. So thank you. Next. Brother over here.
Nancy, Sarah's got the microphone.
So sorry. You'll
We-
be next, of course.
We discussed intrapersonal and talked about the limits that we have of the unknown and fear of the unknown. And it was mentioned that sometimes we look so much at the difference and forget to look at the similarities between us and the person that needs to be included.
That's so important. Thank you. So intrapersonal, material, interpersonal. Thank you. Yes.
We talked about it's really a reaches across transcendental and interpersonal and intrapersonal, and that is expecting to the mutuality of blessings in a relationship, so that you are expecting to receive from a relationship as well as to give.
Thank you for sharing that. It's so important, I think, that thank you first for that specific imagination. I think it's so important that we talk about mutuality. And as we know, our relationships, our friendships, our relationships romantically, our family relationships, not one person can always be giving and not one person can always be receiving. And as time goes on and situations change, one person may give more, the other person may receive more. And the same goes for people with disabilities. There's a theory in disability studies called the spoon theory, where someone with disabilities can communicate how much potential they have to give or to be active or to participate in society by the level of spoons they have. If they have lots of spoons, they can participate really well that day. If they have 1 or 2 spoons, they may need to be on their own and not do anything. And I think that's a way that people with disabilities often communicate. Some days, and often with disability, more days than not, they need to receive. But other days, they may have many spoons, and the person without disabilities may have none. So just participating in that mutuality in such a sincere way is so important. So thank you for sharing that. Any other examples about how our churches and church communities can create disability belonging?
We discussed the primarily material way of being able to share information with those who have learning disabilities or intellectual disabilities. Being able to access paper, written materials in a way that is spoken. We're in the age where we can pick up our phones and it will read text back to us. Being able to perhaps scan a QR code on the order of worship and have it in a plain text format, or it can then be read by a screen reader or something of that kind, meaning that both the pieces of paper that we're seeing now and stuff like the website is more accessible for people both visually and mentally who might not be able to read or for many different reasons.
Thank you for that. I think that's such an important consideration. I actually just had the blessing of being able to, thank you. I just had the blessing and privilege of being able to attend the Institute on Theology and Disability this summer. And one thing that I found super enlightening in that realm is at the beginning of every presentation, someone would start by describing themselves. I'm a 6'1" white man with glasses, a charcoal suit coat, and a red tie. Or starting with that for people who may have visual impairments. Or, as I've tried to exhibit today, presenting the slides in printed format, digital format, earplugs, fidget toys. And as we move, especially in church congregational settings, how do we distribute scriptures? How do we distribute hymns? How do we distribute notes, Sunday school lessons, meal or conversations over meals? All of those are so important. And just imagining as a community what that can look like and tailoring our needs to the specific communities or specific members of our communities that we know and love is so important. So thank you for sharing that. And then last example here.
Okay, so this is about intrapersonal. So I have several disabilities. In my experience with like in the church, it's important for people to know if they're praying for you, it's important for them to know what they're praying for, because I have a few genetic conditions and things that can't be cured. So whenever a lot of people are praying for a cure for me, it almost like kind of takes away the sense of belonging, because it seems like who I am is not belonging in a way. So I think it's important to communicate with the person and ask exactly if they want you to pray for them, what exactly you're praying for.
Thank you, Lily. That's so important. So as a community, we need to make sure that we're a place that lets people with disabilities know that belonging exists. Not just inclusion and not just adaptation and not just a shallow love, but a place where belonging can be created. And belonging can only be created in knowing people, and in knowing people with disabilities, and knowing how to pray, and knowing what to pray. In the same way that your small groups or your devotional groups or your Sunday school groups know each other and know how to pray, there needs to be an environment created where people with disabilities aren't just objects of charity, not just dehumanized, but loved. And that's so important. Thank you. So, thank you all for sharing those examples. I hope that you continue this process amongst yourselves, amongst the people at your table, but also in the groups in Sunday school and also groups in congregational life and outside of this room. So to close our time together, I want to give a reflection. This comes from Song of Songs. Christians throughout the centuries have imagined this song to be from Christ to the church. And as you know from today, the church has people with disabilities. I am one. Many of you are one. And if we live long enough, odds are we may become someone with disabilities. So I want you to imagine with me, to believe with me, that this is what Christ says to you. You are altogether beautiful, my love. There is no flaw in you. Thank you so much for being here today, for listening, for engaging with me. I'm happy to field whatever questions you may have for our remaining few minutes. If you need to get up and go, please feel free to. This is the end of our time together, but if you have any questions, please feel free to field them, to come up and talk about them, or even if you want to catch me after the service, please. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful day. So please feel free to get up and go, and if you have a question, I'm more than happy to pass this mic your way. Or actually, I know I said I would pass the mic, but if anyone has any questions, please just feel free to meet me at the front. Thank you so much.
It's close. it's nice to have. She did swim, but she also was because she was outside. It's real hot. Then you come in and like so